Mrs. Wilson has never flown before, so when she arrived at the airport, she was completely perplexed as to where she should go. So the elderly lady looked around and decided to follow a group of passengers rushing to board their plane. She assumed they would know what to do in this situation. Checking in at the airport seemed incredible, even mythical, to a woman who grew up in one of the state's provincial towns. The elderly lady hid the key to her house in her shoe, as she always does to avoid losing it. Mrs. Wilson put on her best clothes for the trip, but she had no idea the door frame metal detectors would react to it. Other passengers avoided crossing paths with her because they mistook her for a beggar or a woman from a low-income family. That's why the woman at the check-in counter was taken aback when she saw the old lady had a business-class ticket. Mrs. Wilson, meanwhile, nearly missed her flight because she was following passengers flying to the opposite end of the country. Only with the assistance of a kind airport employee did the elderly woman make it to the departure zone, where some of the passengers were already waiting to board the plane. Mrs. Wilson was greeted with a condescending smile as she was led to the gate indicated on her boarding pass. He advised her to wait there so she wouldn't get lost at the airport all over again. The elderly lady fiddled nervously with her purse, occasionally checking her watch. "Is this your first time flying?" asked a nice-looking young man who appeared to be traveling in business class. "Yes, it's my first time, and I'm very nervous." Mrs. Wilson's voice trembled with excitement as boarding began, and the flight attendants smiled politely as they asked the passengers to enter the boarding bridge that connected the airport with the plane, using the old woman's boarding pass. Mrs. Wilson was escorted to her seat by the flight attendant. As it turned out, the old lady's seat was next to a smart-looking man with a sour expression on his face. When he saw Mrs. Wilson, he put down his magazine and asked, "Isn't this business class? Why should I pay more to be seated next to this old beggar?" "Mr. Thompson, please relax. Mrs. Wilson has the same type of ticket as you. It's right here on her boarding pass. Here, take a look," the flight attendant said, desperately trying to maintain her cool. "I'm not interested in anything. I understand. I should have gotten an economy ticket." The obnoxious man raised his voice, still refusing to remove his magazine from Mrs. Wilson's seat. The unfortunate old lady stood there silently watching the argument unfold. All of the other passengers ended up taking sides unknowingly. Some sympathized with Mrs. Wilson, while others were openly opposed to her presence. In the executive suite, the young man she spoke with while waiting to board the flight was one of the old lady's defenders. Unwilling to put up with the man's heinous behavior, he decided to stand up for the old lady. "Oh, for the love of God, Mrs. Wilson is much older than you, and you're acting like a true scumbag," keeping her standing while relaxing in your seat. Mr. Thompson was visibly embarrassed and calmed down after hearing the man's words, but the storm of human indignation among the business class was already unstoppable. With no idea what to do in this situation or how to get things under control, the flight attendant smiled at the elderly lady. Mrs. Wilson realized she had unwittingly become the perpetrator of this scandal. She sighed sadly and said, "Oh well, let's not argue about it. I'll switch to economy class and that'll be the end of it." Her eyes welled up with tears as she said it, and it appeared that her life had lost all meaning at the time, as she felt the withering gazes of several pairs of eyes at the same time. Mr. Thompson relented and removed the magazine from Mrs. Wilson's seat. "Please take a seat, Mrs. Wilson. This is your rightful seat, and you have fully paid for it." The old lady sat down wearily, unable to speak. However, the woman did not notice her handbag opening as she sat down. It ejected an old photograph with curved edges. Mr. Thompson knelt and picked up the photograph, noticing a small boy in it. "This image is probably very meaningful to you," the man inquired, handing the photograph to his elderly neighbor. Mrs. Wilson took the photograph with care, as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. She smiled, and her face brightened, as if all her wrinkles had magically smoothed out. "Yes, this is my son, who works as a pilot. He's actually flying the plane we're on right now," the old lady replied proudly, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief as she heard this poor-looking woman's words. The business class passengers sat down immediately, ready to hear her story. Dorothy Wilson grew up in a low-income family with 4 siblings. Her parents, Kate and John Wilson, ran a small farm that kept them from going hungry during hard times. Dorothy was the oldest of the children, so the burden of raising them fell partially on her shoulders. Peter, the youngest brother, was mentally challenged and required specialized care. When World War II broke out, Dorothy's father enlisted in the army and fought against the Japanese military in the Pacific Islands. Before departing, John Wilson gave his daughter a golden heirloom inherited from his grandfather. He asked Dorothy to look after the family heirloom until he returned. Unfortunately, John Wilson was brought home in a coffin draped in the national flag. The Wilson family was devastated by the loss of their breadwinner and family patriarch. Dorothy's mother became withdrawn after her father's death and never met another man to spend her life with. As time passed, Dorothy was getting older and it was time for her to consider starting her own family, but instead she had to stay with her mother and help care for her mentally challenged brother. Peter Kate's two other children have long since moved to a larger city, leaving their brother, sister, and elderly mother to chance. Dorothy Wilson met her true love only later in life. She was 28 years old and had already given up hope of ever marrying. Jack was attractive, and he was a shepherd who drove flocks of sheep in search of pasture. Dorothy felt as if she were in a fairy tale as their relationship grew so quickly. The couple was planning their wedding, but the Wilson family's bad luck would not allow the poor girl to enjoy her happiness. Dorothy's mentally challenged brother Peter set fire to their house one evening. Jack rushed in to try to save him, but they both died in the fire, leaving them without a home. Dorothy and her mother were confined to an old shack. They bought it with the proceeds from the sale of Jack's sheep. Dorothy discovered she was pregnant at that point. Unfortunately, by that time, her mother had already begun to exhibit signs of dementia, including aggressive behavior. Kate attempted to attack her pregnant daughter with a knife several times, blaming all of her problems on Dorothy. Dorothy gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, but she was terrified that her mother would inadvertently harm the child. Dorothy spent 3 years living in constant fear for the life of her child. Then she became tired of her grief and misfortune. With tears in her eyes, Dorothy decided to send Kevin to an orphanage. Dorothy sincerely believed that the boy would be better off in an orphanage than living under the same roof as his grandmother, who could harm him. Dorothy lived with her mother for several years after leaving her son at the orphanage until her death. Dorothy then returned to the orphanage with the intention of bringing her son home, but the woman was informed that Kevin had been adopted ever since. Dorothy had been trying to find her son for many years, but she had only recently succeeded. It was made possible by a volunteer organization that specialized in the search for missing relatives. As a result, she purchased a business class ticket to be closer to her son, who was flying the plane at the time. Mrs. Wilson happened to see Kevin on her 85th birthday, which was a lucky coincidence. "I can finally die in peace. I'm not sure if I'm going to heaven, but I'm glad my son Kevin is doing well," sobbed the elderly woman. Mrs. Wilson's story did not leave anyone indifferent. Some of them even changed their entire outlook on life. The elderly lady was unaware that after hearing her story, the flight attendant went into the cockpit and spoke to the pilot. An announcement was made over the intercom a few minutes later. "Greetings, passengers. Your captain is speaking. Our flight is coming to a close, but our lives do not have to. Our lives are full of ups and downs, but that is no reason to believe that some of us are luckier than others. We are all born with opportunities, and our lives are determined by how we use them without making mistakes. We will never discover the joy of forgiveness. As a result, we shouldn't look for the guilty when there aren't any, and we shouldn't hold a grudge against someone we don't understand. I'd also like to tell my mother, who is flying with us today, that I love her and have forgiven her a long time ago. She is a decent person who deserves to be respected." Following the pilot's words, the passengers gave him a standing ovation, relieved that everything had gone so well. Mrs. Wilson hugged her son for the first time in many years when the plane touched down, crying with joy as she handed Kevin the golden heirloom she had kept all this time. The man held the family heirloom carefully and cried like a child, unable to control his emotions. He's been waiting for this moment his entire life.